United States and 177 other countries agreed that stabilization was the challenge, and that each country was responsible for adopting policies that would stabilize the population. Now, that was several years ago, and the leadership in this country has done nothing to implement the policy that we agreed with. In a dramatic joint statement, 1992, the United States National Academy of Sciences and the Royal Society of London, two of the world's leading scientific bodies, addressed the state of the planet in the following words, quote, "If current predictions of population growth prove accurate and patterns of human activity on the planet remain unchanged, science and technology may not be able to prevent either irreversible degradation of the environment or continued poverty for much of the world." After 10 years of talk and international conferences, it is not too much, I assume, to hope that the President of the United States and our elected Congress would initiate at least a national dialogue on the issue of sustainability. That's the challenge for every country in the world. There is no country on earth that has an economically, environmentally sustainable economy. Not a single country in the world. All of us are consuming capital and counting it on the profit side of the ledger. Any business that does that goes bankrupt, and countries will go bankrupt too if they continue that policy of consuming capital. What's the capital of any nation? Air, water, soil, forests, rivers, lakes, oceans, scenic beauty, biodiversity. Take that away, and all you have is a wasteland. The President and the Congress refuses to address the problem because it's filled with controversy. Powerful economic interests want cheap labor. Others argue that we're a nation of immigrants, therefore we shouldn't limit the number of immigrants coming into the country. Anybody who advocates a reduction of immigration is charged with racism. That has silenced not only the Congress, the President, but the whole of the great American free press. Until I don't see any solution to that problem unless I'm not a racist, but I do think every country has a right to control and an obligation to control its borders. Not one person in 100,000 in this country, I would guess, knows that we accept more immigrants than all the rest of the world combined, every single year. Now, we're not going to do anything about that until the president at least summons the courage to give an annual message to the country, to the Congress and the country, on the state of our environment. Every president gives a message to the Congress every year on the state of the Union. The state of the Union is totally dependent upon the state of the environment. That's the bottom line. Until the president gives it the prestige of the presidency to this issue, people aren't going to take it seriously. And joined with that, Congress must start a series of hearings on the implications on sustainability. What will it take to achieve sustainability, economically, environmentally? And there should be at least one hearing a month on into the future, as far as we can see, because the issues are important. They must be understood. Let me conclude on one example. The national parks will be all washed up, all done in another 25 to 30 years. They will be theme parks, racetracks for off-road vehicles, snowmobiles, water-propelling water vehicles. We will destroy the greatest park system in the world unless we tackle that along with 100 other questions. And I think if you ask the public, would you bar SUVs, off-road vehicles, water skis, and all that from the park system, if you knew it would save the parks in their natural condition for your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and unless you do that, they'll be gone. That's the kind of discussion we have to start in this country. Unless we do, we will never achieve sustainability. Thank you.
Responsibility, the charge certainly has come to us. The question is, what can and should we do about it? A start the discussion because I know he's never at a loss for words. So, and usually good ones.
Are the acoustics okay? Can you guys hear out there? All right. Well, the first thing I'd want to do is urge you to buy Gaylord's book. Not only because it's such a clear capture of what we've been hearing from Senator Nelson's voice over the past 40 years, but also because it is so forward-looking in terms of what it says about an action agenda for the future. But that's not the only reason I would urge you to buy the book. I asked him for a copy of the book, and the publisher sent me as a Xerox sheet. And if you don't buy it, you'll wind up with something like this. When Gaylord Nelson initiated Earth Day, he mobilized millions of citizens in this country on behalf of the environment. And I just wanted to note, I've always been nervous about citizen involvement. You really almost have to beware of citizens, because all of you are citizens, and so lurking out there under the guise of being citizens are a whole bunch of people that could just as well be on this panel telling stories about Gaylord Nelson or talking about the environment and sustainability. George Meyer is here, former DNR Secretary, Bud Jordahl is here, Phil Lewis is here, Emily Early, Hugh Wildes, I can go on and on, Doug LaFollette, many others. The audience itself is a great repository of information on this subject. Because Senator Nelson was good enough to label me with the water tag, I felt obliged to tell at least one or two quick anecdotes relating to water and Senator Gaylord Nelson. Some of you know that I suffer a serious addiction to fishing. And for many, many years, I fell victim to the Wisconsin mystique of angling for muskies, the fish of 10,000 casts, and all these great challenges. And I was describing this to Senator Nelson at a northern Wisconsin location when he and his able friend and guide, Martin Hansen, pointed out that he had done that once. And he went out and in an hour or so quickly harvested 6 of these muskies and said, "This isn't enough of a challenge, let's go back to the bar." Which leads into the second little anecdote about Senator Nelson. He was talking about the fact that water is one of many liquids that can be enjoyed. One thing I've learned from the senator over the years is that water and spirits and politics are very miscible. They mix well. And I think of an evening up in the north, hearing the senator as water was being mixed with spirits, and politics were being discussed on and on to the evening. And at the end of the evening, there was only one person still holding forth with both water and spirits, discussing politics. And as everybody went to bed, I thought, the senator is going to just absolutely be beat down tomorrow morning. Well, he was the first person up, wearing a bright yellow windbreaker, looking like he had 9 hours of great sleep, and everybody else we saw looked highly disheveled. And it's something that about Gaylord Nelson that you marvel at over the years, how resilient he is. But there is a dark side to him, and I just did want to say one thing about that. He's reached that point in his life where most of these occasions are filled with applause, and nobody talks about the dark side. And I just wanted to make one note on that. I see that a few of you are part of what has been an endangered species, Democrats out there, and some of you are long in the tooth, in fact, working in that pursuit. And you'll recall that in a very unusual circumstance, there was some factionalism among Democrats some decades ago. And the world was divided into sort of the Nelson camp and the Lucy camp. And I had the good fortune as a younger person to be there at the rapprochement between these two camps, and we're going to be discussing how they move the Democratic agenda forward. I was working for Governor Lucy at the time. I don't know the details of what happened. One can only draw inferences from the facts. But the next morning, the governor was busy showering, and the water stopped. And so when Senator Nelson appeared in front of the national TV cameras that day, he looked terrific. When Governor Lucy appeared, there was still soap in his hair. And I know to this day that he's suspicious that Gaylord turned the spigot. Well, anyway, I want to just say a couple of things here. Today I want to say a few words about water, a few words about sustainability, and a word or two that I hope might lead to some discussion a little bit later on in the afternoon. Incidentally, this is a scheduling event of great hubris because all you folks are here bypassing the Green Bay Packers, and if you're younger, you're bypassing whatever this homecoming event was, so it's a scheduling challenge. It's nice to see folks inside. I think most of you are aware in the water world, if you look at the numbers as it relates to water, Gaylord said, you know, in the 1900s there were 1.6 billion people on the planet. Today we look at 6 billion people. During that period of time, water withdrawals have increased about sevenfold in terms of demands on water systems. And we have enough water to meet our demands globally if only it were distributed fairly equitably and where needed. But of course it isn't. If you go to Africa, you find the Congo captures 30% of the annual runoff in Africa, and yet only 10% of the population lives in that basin. So we've got these great disparities on location. So things are going to have to change to deal with population and to deal with the increasing demands on our water resources. And we're at a time of great change. Up until now, we've always assumed that we could create new supplies, largely through dams and diversions and reservoirs and so forth. We're coming to a time now where if we're going to honor the credo of sustainability, we're going to have to move into demand management, conservation, and reuse. And so that will be a theme in this next century as it pertains to water if we're going to move in the direction of sustainability. Because of Earth Day, the ecosystem worldwide now is part of the accounting for water. When we met our needs, significant things happened that advanced the human cause, but they came at the expense of natural capital. We now have to recognize what Gaylord has been saying for years, that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, and that nature bats last, and we're going to have to meet the needs for healthy aquatic ecosystems. Of course, human needs are going to be foremost in a globalized world. I think you all have seen the numbers, and something like 1 billion people do not have access to clean drinking water. And 3 billion people, almost half the population of the planet, don't have access to adequate sanitation. And about 30,000 people die every day from waterborne diseases, and most of those are children. And these are not rocket science problems. These are issues we have the capacity to deal with. And so meeting these human needs is going to be a priority in terms of how we use our water. Now, I want to just give one quick illustration, and I'm going to use dams as an example. We have dammed and altered almost every major river system in the world. We've generated power, we provided water for agriculture and municipal, industrial needs, and so forth. But today, there's something like 800,000 dams. We're not even sure of the number in the world, and probably 75,000 of these very big mega dams in the world. A dam does a lot for people, but from the river's point of view, it's the single most cataclysmic event in the life of a river. It stops that flood pulse, it breaks up the upstream and downstream connections, and has all kinds of deleterious effects. And so today, we see efforts in environmental restoration where we are slowly beginning to undo some of these damages, way too slowly in the eyes of somebody like Ed Abbey. But we, in this state alone, have taken out 60 or so dams in the past few decades with some great leadership from citizen groups and DNR, a national leader in restoring ecosystems. And we're seeing across the country, many, many hundreds of dams have been removed, getting increasingly larger in size. And it's reflective of a huge change in societal values. And so to think about sustainability as we think about our vital water resources, we have to entertain these kinds of major changes. And I just want to say one or two words about sustainability, which has been Senator Nelson's principal theme over the last decades. And I confess it's hard to talk about sustainability at a time when we're thinking about some pretty unsustainable actions with regard to war and with regard to the collective well-being of countries across the world. And so it makes me nervous to talk about it. What I'm going to do then is localize my comments as they relate to water and sustainability in Wisconsin. We have an upcoming event in about a week called the Waters of Wisconsin. Some of you may have seen a letter of invitation from Senator Nelson, the newspapers, that captured the importance of that event. And part of that Waters of Wisconsin forum, which is taking place next week, is dealing with a set of sustainability principles in which we're trying to move from some generalities in terms of how do you apply the concept of sustainability to the specifics of bringing sustainability into every decision that one makes, whether it's individual, as a business, as a nonprofit group, as a state government, as a legislature. And I think there'll be an opportunity for some real discourse on how to give life and reality to those principles and demands for sustainability. And I hope we'll see a number of your faces there at the forum next week. Finally, I think Senator Nelson has set the plate in not ducking controversial issues here. The issue of population planning, family planning, immigration issues. You can come down in some different places on nuances of this topic. They're certainly provocative topics, and by sticking our head in the sand, we do nothing to sustain the world. I want to talk about a little different angle on this. In Gaylord's book, you'll find a discussion of brown lashing, the brown lash, backlash from private property, wise use community, and some greenwashing comments. I want to put it in a little different context and just leave it hanging as a question as I close my remarks. If you look at what's happened in the last 30-odd years in the United States, you've seen that the way we've tried to clean up our waters and other parts of our environment, air, soil, and so forth, is we've moved from a very strong command, control, and regulatory approach, and have done some very good work where we've enforced those laws, to an attempt to try to be more responsive to market-like signals and make our pollution abatement efforts both effective and more cost-effective and efficient, to where today the paradigm that everybody refers to is collaboration, that we're going to kind of collaborate our way out of these problems. And I think most of us subscribe to that, working together. It isn't DNR's environment, it's not the state's environment, it's all of our environments. And so the question is, how do we bring that full array of affected interests into the discourse to figure out what we should do next? And what we've had happen in the United States is the birthing, and around the world for that matter, the birthing of local stewardship groups, Friends of Rivers, watershed partnerships, land conservancies, and on and on. And that's a very, very positive trend in terms of local stewardship and citizens taking ownership of problems. But there's a dark side potentially to that too, and it's one we ought to be aware of. The potential is there for short-term and immediate thinking. I see so many of these Friends of the Rivers groups who are doing good things in terms of building sweat equity in the community, planting some trees and doing a cleanup over a mile of stream while the other 500 square miles of watershed are being raped and denuded. So there's a whole issue of doing small things and good things, but things that are not particularly consequential. There's a great risk of localism. And the Quincy Library Group is a group you guys would know something about perhaps in terms of forest management. We want to engage citizens and local stakeholders in the private sector, but there's also the risk of only meeting local needs and not honoring the larger set of needs, which is why some environmental organizations nationally have been very suspicious of these collaborative approaches. And finally, there's always the risk with these new collaborative enterprises of capture, of people not concerned about the environment using these vehicles as a way of doing business and making some gains, but at far less expense to them. And so there's a whole set of issues that come up with the changing way we go about environmental management collaboratively in the world, working together, that we ought to be taking a careful look at. I'm going to shut up. It's a pleasure to be here today and to honor Senator Nelson, and as a whole variety of authors have said over eons of time, buy this book.
I'd like to introduce the next panelist, Huffecker, the CEO of the Aldo Leopold Foundation and a well-recognized voice for conservation and stewardship here in Wisconsin.
Thank you, Tom. As the executive director of the Aldo Leopold Foundation, I kind of have strange communications at times, and every once in a while I'll answer the telephone, Aldo Leopold Foundation, and they'll say, yes, I'm looking for Mr. Leopold. You know, you missed him. I'm in the office right now, but I take a message, maybe he could get back to you. Felt a little bit that way when UW Press contacted me and asked me to be part of this distinguished panel. I was like, Mr. Leopold is not here, you're not speaking to him. This is, in fact, Buddy Huffecker, Hufffaker. I know Senator Nelson is really interested in having your organization represented and speak to his legacy. And so it's a huge honor and pleasure to be a part of this panel as a young conservationist because of the legacies of everyone up here and in this room as a whole in the state of Wisconsin. And I could argue that perhaps out of this panel up here, I'm the greatest beneficiary of Mr. Senator Nelson's vision of Earth Day because I missed it completely. I was 2 months yet before I would enter this world and be a new citizen that would have the pleasure of being part of a society that did in fact care enough to recognize the importance of the environment, even if only for 24 hours. And so it's, it's just kind of an amazing thing to think about. And this book, I would echo Steve's comment that everyone should buy it. Those of you who are as young and naive as me, it provides a real fascinating insight into how the idea emerged and developed both within Senator Nelson's own thinking as well as how it actually got implemented. And if there's any question, I think, about Senator Nelson's visionary tendencies, that was quickly resolved where in the back, one of the appendices is the letter to President Kennedy by the Senator explaining the need and what should be discussed in a nationwide conservation tour. Now, the book goes on to explain how that was kind of unfulfilling in terms of the Senator's vision, but I think what is laid out in there is amazing, and if we could garner that same kind of leadership within maybe perhaps not this administration, but perhaps a future administration, it would be amazing, I think, what kind of dialogue could be started. Well, because that was not an overwhelming success, Senator Nelson had to move on and came up with the small idea of having the largest social event, a social demonstration in the history of the country. Not a shabby second alternative, huh? And let me just, I have a variety of notes that I've been trying to take, but at the Leopold Foundation, we're working to foster ecological literacy through the legacy of Aldo Leopold. And I would argue that Senator Nelson is one of those keystones in how that legacy has continued to be perpetuated, and the mantle has been passed, and I think he's calling us forward to action again. And Steve threw out some stats about water. One of the disconcerting things to me is that the average American citizen knows less than 10 native plants and animals. Can you believe that? 10? I mean, that is just pathetic. And yet, Earth Day, for urban population of our country, which is now nearly 80%, this is, a marker in our calendar year that puts these issues on the map. And he makes a great argument for how, in fact, Earth Day is not just a 24-hour celebration or recognition, that it is a year-long and it's an evolving idea and concept. But nevertheless, to have that day carved out, I think is terribly important, because for some people, this is the only time of the year that people consciously, direct their attention to our environment. And that seed, has the potential, if nothing else, the potential to grow into something much more at a later date if nourished and watered and fed and so forth. And we were also asked a little bit to comment about what one book can do. And I perhaps have some insights to share on that as being somewhat the steward of the entity that holds the rights to a Sand County Almanac. It's kind of interesting. Probably all of us would agree that a Sand County Almanac as a single volume is, well, of course I'm going to agree to this, but it is the premier conservation text and writing ever produced within this country. My bias obviously set aside there. But it has only sold a little bit over 2 million copies. It's probably been read much more broadly than that, because many times it's used as a textbook, and so those just get recycled over and over until the covers wear off, and finally the bookstore orders new copies. But think of the numbers of people that celebrate Earth Day each year, and how many of those, perhaps I need to cut a check to Senator Nelson, because we still get royalties from book sales. How many people get introduced to Sand County Almanac on Earth Day, pick that up, and have a transformative experience because of that read? The numbers are astonishing, I think, again, when you think about the value of Earth Day. But as Senator Nelson clearly identifies in his book, the new book, Beyond Earth Day, that this is an evolving idea. Our relationship to the environment is only beginning to be, I think, better understood. And so what I think is valuable, especially valuable about this volume, is that it identifies the current problems out there. It's not afraid of reality. Steve and the senator spoke to some of those population, water use, environmental pollution, and so forth. But it sets the stage for what we're really up against, so that we can be realistic in terms of how we develop our strategies to change our relationship to the land. And two, and I just, as again, a young conservationist and professional, feel that this is extremely important. It sets forth a visionary concept of how we can relate to the land and how we can solve these solutions. Steve mentioned part of the text is discussing the brown lands and the kind of anti-conservation and anti-environmental rhetoric and arguments that are out there. And conservation largely, the environmental community largely has not acknowledged that and came up with a better reason or a vision of what the end game is for conservation. What kind of society can we really be if we embrace these values, and either take them on directly head on, or just go start playing on a new field. Let's go do our own thing and leave them behind. either way, Senator Nelson, begins to address that. He talks about how we really can take these issues on and do something much more constructive than what's currently going on. And then finally, and I just see this every day in my work through a St. County Almanac, is a volume like this creates space. It creates space for each of us to come together, and it uses both words and ideas that we can then relate to one another so that we can kind of get on the same page and figure out where to go from here. And I just think it's a terribly important role for a volume like this, and I just want to thank the Senator personally for his contributions, both this most recent one and his long commitment, enduring commitment to conservation. So thank you.
I'd like to call now on Professor Joe Moran, who's an emeritus professor at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay and a resident scientist with the American Meteorological Society, who I suspect is going to say something about climate.
Great being here. I spend part of my time in Washington and part of my time in Green Bay, and I much prefer being in Green Bay than being in Wisconsin from an environmental standpoint. I was reminded, reading Senator Nelson's book, I was reminded of a problem I had when I left the UW-Madison campus back in 1969 for my first academic job, which is at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. That fall of 1969, the new UW Green Bay campus, four-year campus, opened up. And we had as a major theme, and we still do, the environment, human environment, the physical, biological environment. And my job, my first teaching job really, was to teach a course on environmental science, environmental studies. And thinking about those days, it was a real challenge. We had 250 students show up that first class, and they expected to learn about the environment and everything there is to know about the environment. Unfortunately, the professor's crutch, which is the textbook, was not available. There were no textbooks in those days. There was St. County Almanac, there were readings, selected readings, but there was no formalized textbook that was available. And so that created a challenge right off the bat. And in effect, in designing the course, we ended up really having a great deal of freedom to come up with ideas as to what might constitute environmental science. That was the state of the situation at that time. Many of us had no background, no formal background in conservation. And yet that really is the foundation of modern environmental science. In reading Senator Nelson's book, I realized that there's a great deal of history since 1969. The field of environmental science has matured. It has become a well-recognized field. And a lot of people are involved in what they call environmental science. Really, it's applied science, it's interdisciplinary science, or system science. It's essentially dealing with problems that span many, many different disciplines and in various institutions around the world, around this country, in the state. Institutes for Environmental Studies were formed to try to foster, to encourage interdisciplinary work. It's not always successful. We need more of it. One of the barriers that you're facing in trying to pursue interdisciplinary studies is the traditional structure of a college or a university, where the budgets are divided up by departments. And oftentimes it's very difficult to encourage faculty to collaborate across disciplinary boundaries. One of the really neat things about the University of Wisconsin is that the university here in Madison especially has succeeded in crossing those disciplinary boundaries. Because the problems they deal with, whether it's endangered species, the threats to the stratospheric ozone hole, climate variability, whatever it might be. Those are problems that span disciplines, that require input from biologists, from physical scientists, from chemists, from geologists. It goes on and on. One needs to do that. And reading the book by Senator Nelson, the theme of the importance of education came through. When I came to the University of Wisconsin Green Bay that day back in 1969 and started my career there, my teaching career, I had no idea that environmental science was going to be what it became. But I knew there was something going on because the students were interested. The students, of course, at that time were very active on other issues, other social issues, the Vietnam War and so forth. This campus was a place of great unrest and concern on the part of the student body, but not just about the war, about social issues, about environmental science, about environmental concerns of various types. And with people like Senator Nelson, this all has continued, and it has matured. It's developed depth and breadth and respect. Earth Day in 1970, that day was the last time a tornado struck Green Bay, Wisconsin. It was in the evening. There was a group of people gathered over at the Brown County Memorial Arena to help celebrate Earth Day. And outside the arena, a weak, fortunately, tornado was whipping through. It was a whirlwind, but I couldn't help but think the appropriateness of it all. It was a whirlwind of change, of new ways of looking at things, new ways of approaching science, and that has that took root at that time and is still with us today. I suppose because I'm a meteorologist, I'm supposed to say something about climate change. And people ask me whether I think the climate is changing, and I immediately say, of course, no question about it, the climate is changing. The reason I can be so adamant, so confident in that statement is because we know climate has always changed. It's always changed. That's what the geologists tell us, those people from the other discipline down the hall or in the next building. Climate is always changing. There's no reason to expect that suddenly it's going to stop changing. It's going to change. How it's going to change, that's a different story. I have the foggiest. We have a strong consensus of opinion among atmospheric scientists and people from other fields that global warming has occurred. There's a strong consensus also that is somehow tied to human activity, particularly the buildup of carbon dioxide. There seems to be that consensus, but we have to be cautious about science by consensus. It may be true. It may be true. And certainly there's so much at stake that we need probably is to do something about that, about the issue. We are. Many people that are trying to do their part. However, we need to recognize that there are certain limitations, certain challenges that the researchers are trying to deal with today. And one of the most important of these is how climate change at a global scale translates to particular areas, like Wisconsin, into particular sectors of society, like economics and agriculture. And what we hear about mostly, I guess, in the press is the change in temperature that's anticipated. Global warming. I do a lot of work with teachers around the country, working with the American Meteorological Society. And they want to know about global warming. Hardly any of them ask us to talk about global climate change, which is really the scientific approach to this issue. Okay. The final item that I'd like to get into, I don't have any notes here like that, but the issue really goes back to what Steve said before. Sure, we should be concerned about global warming and its possibilities and its effects, but we should take one step beyond that and look at the effects on our water system. That seems to be the emerging concern among scientists who really look at this issue in in any great detail what the effects of changes in temperature would be on the global water supply, on the frequency of drought, on the frequency of excessive rains, flooding, in different locations of the world. I think that in the years to come, you'll see more and more emphasis on that. When I read Senator Nelson's book, I see a glimpse back into the past as to how things have occurred. I also see a vision for the future. He gets into a number of issues which are evolving today, which are going to be with us for the decades to come. And global climate change being one of them. And there's so many questions to be answered. It's an exciting time to be a student, I imagine. And let me just say one thing about students. I taught for 32 years. And my last classes as a teacher, I became more and more impressed with our students. I have a great deal of faith in what they will do in the future in terms of grappling with many of these environmental issues. It's easy to criticize students to say that, well, their grade point averages are inflated and this, that, and the other. There's a lot of really bright students out there, very dedicated, who will make lots of contributions in the future. So I'm optimistic that although these issues are there, and Senator Nelson has outlined them, I think they're going to be grappled with, whether it be sustainability, global climate change, water quality problems, whatever. I think it's going to happen, and I'm very optimistic. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And our final panelist is Mike Dumbag, who is acting administrator of Bureau of Land Management and chief of the Forest Service, and is now a University of Wisconsin system-wide professor, a very special category with his home base in Stevens Point, and we're delighted that he's come to his senses, come back to Wisconsin from Washington.
Well, thank you, Tom, and I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here with Senator Nelson. And although I was ordered to fill up the space between now and 3 o'clock, I'm going to violate that, and by a lot, as a matter of fact. I want to tell a few stories. I want to tell a few stories about Gaylord Nelson and what Gaylord Nelson and the kinship has meant to me in my career. He was elected to the state legislature the year that I was born. I was in 5th grade when he became governor. I remember him campaigning for the Senate, and I was a freshman at Hayward High School. And I was a senior in college, marching on Earth Day in 1970. And then I got busy and was dating and got married, and he was busy in Washington doing all the good things he was doing. And the next time I saw Gaylord Nelson, which I think he had just a little bit to do with, he thought my life was just a little bit too easy, and he thought I needed a more challenging job. And I ended up as chief of the Forest Service in that pressure cooker. And Gaylord, so I was sitting in the chief's office, and Gaylord and Martin Hansen stopped by to see me for lunch. Do you remember that day? And I was grappling with the issue of an $8.4 billion public liability in a road system on the national forests. The fact that we had 386,000 miles of roads in the national forest, and only 18% of them were maintained to standards, and we had sedimentation problems and landslide problems and access problems, and every time I went out east or west or south, the county commissioners would all say, why isn't the Forest Service doing a better job in taking care of its roads? And in addition to that, the roads budget had been plummeting. So what do? Well, I had been mulling this over, and Martin and Gaylord came in, and I grew up on the Chequamegon in northern Wisconsin, and Martin lives there. And I was looking at some of the statistics. And one of the statistics from Wisconsin was the fact that 79% of the Chequamegon and Nicolay National Forests were within a quarter of a mile of a road. And I'm thinking, I had my pencil out and I'm thinking, that's 1,320 feet. Can that be possible? So I said to Gaylord, well, he said, I'm not sure. I'd better ask Martin. He lives up here and up there in Mellon. So we did. And yes, we agreed that that was probably right. And the next time I saw Gaylord in a public way, we were with the President of the United States, formally announcing the roadless policy, which the subsequent administration decided, well, we really didn't need that policy all that much, and we really wouldn't defend it. But I will declare, thanks to Senator Nelson and his encouragement, that really the road building era on the National Forest is over. There may be some miles, not very much. And I would also say that even though many people think Senator Nelson might be the height of liberalism, the fact is he's an arch conservative, because nothing could be more conservative than keeping the few remaining wild areas wild. Nothing could be more conservative than keeping clean water clean. Nothing could be more conservative than many of the policies and environmental statements that he has made. That's conservative, taking care of what you have, saving something for the future. And somehow this whole definition of what's conservative and what's liberal has been totally flip-flopped. So my last point will be buy the book. I had the distinct pleasure of reviewing a pre-publication copy of Senator Nelson's book. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Felt like I was part of it because I was there through some of the evolution of what he was writing about. And somehow, Gaylord, I'm just not possibly old enough to be part of history. But it's wonderful to be associated with people like Senator Nelson. And I think, I just want you to say, how many Americans and how many citizens of Wisconsin and how many little boys and girls that you have influenced and set down the right path. Thank you.
Senator Nelson has agreed to take questions from the audience. So we're fine for time this afternoon. So if you have some questions you'd like to ask or points you'd like to bring up for him or for the other panelists too, this would be the time to do it. Please.
Well, I'm part of history. I knew Gaylord Nelson before he even held office. And I think history will say that the greatest thing he ever did for the world was not, for this country, was not weak as the original thing was, but speaking out about immigration regulation. He's the only man I know, the only person I know in the country that has the wisdom and the bravery to do that. I find that, for example, referring to this cooperation on problems, the conservation people, the environmental people have been co-opted by builders, for example, and the promoters, and they are enthusiastically supporting the oxymoron smart growth. This is a crime to the people in the world that are forced to live in cities because of the greed that makes cities. And the children obviously don't know more than 12 plants. They don't see more than 12 plants. And congratulations, dear. Keep it up.
Any other questions or comments? You?
I would like to compliment Gaylord Nelson for the guts and courage with which he talks about these difficult issues. Most university professors, and I was one for 45 years here, don't like to touch the P word. Men alive, they'll do anything but squirm mentioned is abortion. Nobody, even Gaylord Nelson was careful to skirt that a little bit. There are 50 to 60 million abortions in the world each year. If you add that to the present 83 million that are being added to the world population, you would have 153 million people added to the world population each and every year. And Gaylord Nelson has the courage to talk about population, which most university professors do not talk about. Believe me, even some of those that are sitting on this panel, they don't like to talk about it. The consequence of this is that a woman like Senator Rosenzweig from Milwaukee or Wauwatosa, or wherever she is, was defeated. A good, solid senator, a Republican, God bless her. I'm not a Republican. Was defeated by the right to lifers because she has the courage to get up and say a woman should have the right to choose. And in the Mexican City policy of the conference in Mexico City, the United States government defeated efforts to have this discussed. So you here who are sitting in this room, whether you're Republican or Democrat or for Tommy Thompson's brother, you have a tremendous big stake in how this subject is discussed. Your personal stake and a global stake, because the population issue is the fundamental issue that's going to defeat everything and anything you do if you don't grapple with it and solve it.
George Meyer, and I'd ask the people who are going to have a question or make a comment, please face the audience generally so that everyone can hear, please.
I just wanted to once again give honor to Senator Nelson. I know that for any of the professionals that are going up there to zero, give them the mentor, the wife, whatever. Clearly, in 1970, the educational efforts from Earth Day.
Excuse me, can you hear, George?
Yeah. Okay. Clearly, in 1970, through the educational efforts, you galvanized the movement that made it forward. Your book lists the 20 or so environmental laws that came out of that era. The challenges, and had great success. The challenges that we face in adopting your book are tremendous and needs a kind of galvanization again. What are your recommendations and suggestions of the best way to revive that whole effort that's needed to move this administration and really the international community to deal with those problems?
Is that the only question you have?
We were afraid you might come up with a hard one.
I think, as I said in my remarks, until the President and the Congress recognize the issue, we aren't going to really do anything about it. Now, they don't have to have any courage. No, I mean that. The President could give an annual message on sustainability based upon the National Academy of Sciences or all the scientific groups around, and without taking a stand on a single issue, just report on the state of the environment as the scientific community estimated it. Congress wouldn't have to have any courage at all, accepting the courageous statement, there is a public right to know. I don't think anybody should be frightened from saying that. Therefore, we need to have a series of hearings at least once a month on the basic issues. As I said in reference to the national parks, if the people understood what was happening to the parks, they would be willing to support what was necessary to preserve the integrity of the parks. So it doesn't take any courage to have the hearings and hear the voice of the experts all over the country.
Any other comments or questions? Yes, one in the back, please.
All right. Well, first I'd like to say I'm inspired by Senator Nelson's accomplishments and his continuing passion for these issues. I wanted to ask another question about the P word, though. And that question is, you alluded to some of the reasons why interest in population issues seem to peak at times and then valley out at other times. But